Welcome. Hi, everyone. It's good to see a full room in here tonight, and maybe we'll get a little overflow out there. Welcome to PNCA. My name is Peter Semensky. I'm the chair of the Visual Studies program here. And it's my great pleasure tonight to welcome you to a talk and presentation and Q&A with Michelle Grabner. So the way tonight is going to work, Michelle is going to present for about 20 minutes or so, and then there'll be a conversation moderated by Mac McFarland, the director of the galleries here at PNCA and MOCC. And Michelle is with us tonight. She's been with us for the past couple days with the Visual Studies program, and she's been doing studio visits with several of our graduate students. This is one of the great pleasures of bringing in artists and curators to our program. Tonight, one of the students who had a visit with Michelle today will be introducing Michelle. Her name is Anastasia Greer. I'll pass it off now. Welcome.
Hi. Michelle Grabner is a visual artist, writer, teacher, and curator who works in a variety of mediums, including drawing, painting, video, and sculpture. Grabner's work is grounded in process and productivity and seeks Platonic ideals of orderliness and routine. She pursues these principles through her domestic environment and everyday life, appropriating textile patterns from household fabrics. As David Knorr writes in the introduction to her exhibition at MoCA Cleveland, all of Grabner's activities are driven by distinctive values and ideas, working outside of dominant systems, working tirelessly, working across platforms and towards community. When curating shows, Grabner is most interested in connecting with artists who are always becoming and shifts away from an exclusionary curatorial approach. Grabner holds an MA in art history and a BFA in painting and drawing from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and an MFA in art theory and practice from Northwestern University. She became chair of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago's esteemed painting and drawing department in the fall of 2009. Her writing has been published in Modern Painters, Art Forum, Frieze, Art Press, and Art Agenda, among others. Grabner and her husband, artist Brad Killam, run the Suburban, which was established in response to the idea that the suburbs were an overlooked site for avant-garde activities. Grabner and her husband also founded the Poor Farm, a not-for-profit art space and residency. Grabner has had solo exhibitions of her work at the Indianapolis Museum of Art, the Museum of Contemporary Art Cleveland, Innova, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, Ulbricht's Museum, Wichita, and University Galleries, Illinois State University. She has been included in group shows at MCA Chicago, Walker Art Center Minneapolis, Tate St. Ives UK, and Kunsthal Bern. Her work is included in the permanent collection of Walker Art Center Minneapolis, MCA Chicago, Mudam Luxembourg, Milwaukee Art Museum, Wisconsin, Madison Museum of Contemporary Art, Daimler Contemporary, Berlin, Smithsonian American Art Museum, Washington, D.C., and the Victoria and Albert Museum, London. Grabner co-curated the 2014 Whitney Biennial at the Whitney Museum of American Art along with Anthony Elms and Stuart Comer. Grabner is the curator of the 2016 Portland Biennial of Contemporary Art. Please join me and the MFA in Visual Studies students at PNCA in welcoming Michelle Grabner.
Can you put the first image on, please? Thank you. Anastasia, thank you. That was terrific. Okay. So what I'm going to do is give you a visual walkthrough of some of those things that Anastasia laid out in terms of my work, my thinking, my curatorial practice, my studio practice, and some things that I'm thinking about, things that I think within a contemporary context are quite relevant. And one of those things is ennui or boredom. Thinking about boredom, thinking about time, how one can control time is important. We've been seeing boredom, the idea of boredom, pictured in paintings for quite some time. We're looking here at an Arnold Böcklin painting, Odysseus on the island of Calypso. And in representational painting, boredom is depicted by looking out in grayness. So boredom is part of the human condition. Looking out into this grayness, we have Odysseus, even being on the island with the promise of infinite sex, calypso, their boredom sets in. So repetition and its relationship to boredom is important. This is an extraordinary painting. It's at the Tate Britain, where the largest collection of Pre-Raphaelite paintings exists in the collection. This is Evert Millet's, and it's Mariana, and it's from 1850. And I love this painting only by the fact that here we have boredom represented in the body. You can see it in the aching back. It's also important to me that what you see, what she's doing, she's standing up from needlework, women's work, right? And again, we have looking out into nature, looking out the window, gazing outward. So again, the condition of boredom, and I'm talking about situational boredom. I'm not talking about profound boredom in which one must be medicated. There are those situations. But being able to be in places of work and labor in which you control time, right? To the point of it being uncomfortable. What you don't want is time to control you, and we know it does, right? Our contemporary context, time is always controlling us. So boredom is a key. We have a tendency, I would a little conspiratorial speak here in terms of thinking about capital. Capital doesn't want us to be bored. We're not consuming if we're in a state of boredom. So we have a condition in which boredom is not acceptable. Maybe your 9-year-old can say they're bored, but that's the only time we're really catching it. So I advocate, and I set up these situations in my own studio. Something else that I continue to embrace, and this is why I said yes immediately to being asked to curate the 2016 Portland Biennial, is studios. It's the place of artists. It's where artists have control. It's the first impact in terms of thinking, making, and so forth. So any opportunity to go into studios, I learned so much, and I continue to learn so much. I've been into a lot of studios, but artists never cease to amaze me. So I find it to be a privilege. So studying the studio, thinking about the idea of studio conditions. Here we have a still from Bruce Naumann's Fat Chance John Cage. Bruce Naumann set up the studio, this video camera, the surveillance video, infrared, to see if he could capture what happens at night when it's dark, when he is not in there working. What is going on? What kind of magic happens? And what he recorded is a lot of nothingness, but maybe bugs and some cats and some mice. So you have a little animal world that sneaks in at night. The studio is not only my interest, it has become the interest of institutions. Yes, in this case, marking a genius painter, Francis Bacon, transporting very authentically his studio from Chelsea, London to Hugh Lane, Dublin. Behind glass, you're looking through it, you're looking into the ephemera, the space in which Bacon painted. And we see this pretty regularly. We see studios now, we see institutions taking on the recreation or the making or the transportation of artist studios. So here we have the traditional, very romantic studio. Here we have Danelle Wolford. I'll talk about Danelle Wolford when we talk about the biennial briefly. Danelle Wolford is a fictional artist. She is acted out by a woman actor named Jen Kidwell in collaboration with Joe Scanlon, who is the artist who worked to invent her. And here's a studio shot. So we have Danelle, who doesn't really exist, even though she had a gallery for quite some time. She has a resume. You can find her work online and so forth. So we have a post-studio artist being represented here. Rob Storr writes quite a lot about de Kooning and how de Kooning, in his slight uncomfortableness with the amount of revenue his paintings were generated, in this case in the 80s and over the years, and that what de Kooning would do is dump all those resources as much as he could back into the studio, where he would create these exquisite promenades where he could walk and look at paintings above, he could sleep and nap, and so the paintings were always present. You can see his tools and so forth. So again, the idea of the studio, investing back into the studio. And this is a painting by Rochelle Feinstein. Rochelle Feinstein reminds us in these paintings here, these two paintings, that the studio is also a place of storage, right? That we make a lot of things and we're responsible for those things, whether we keep them, whether we move them out, whether we get rid of them. But we often forget that the studio is also a place of storage. So yes, so I, again, am standing up here with the privilege to say I'm headed into and have been into a lot of studios already throughout this state. A little bit about some of the spaces I run very quickly. This is the Suburban. The Suburban is an outbuilding and two other galleries in the building behind it. My studio was on the second floor. We recently moved. So this is in Oak Park, Illinois, a first-ring suburb of Chicago. Oak Park is known for its Frank Lloyd Wright buildings. Frank Lloyd Wright built his home and studio in Oak Park, and there's exquisite examples of many kind of series of styles of architecture, including developing prairie style. Oak Park is interesting also not only because of Frank Lloyd Wright, but Frank Lloyd Wright chose to build a home and studio and use the suburbs as a place of work, as opposed to going into the city and working with Louis Sullivan, taking the train into the city. So the idea that we would use this outbuilding that came with this home that we purchased in 1997, that we would transform it into an exhibition space. And then two other exhibition space. We've since moved to Milwaukee, where the Suburban is up and running, and I'll show you an image of that in a little bit. But to walk through a couple projects, here we have Walid Beshti and his FedEx project, where he ships these very minimalist glass boxes that fit perfectly into the FedEx boxes, and inevitably they will break, but that break is something that he solicits. They accrue value the more they start to break down. And again, there's a critique then of minimalism inherent in that. And he decided, so what we end up doing is we invite an artist who will then extend the invitation to work in another space, and Walid invited Jim Welling, and you can see Jim Welling photos in the back. The Suburban it's not a not-for-profit. It's an artist-run space. On occasion works sell, but it's not something we negotiate. It's not something we're interested in. We will just hand that off to connect the artist to the interested party. But it is, what is important to me is that it's extension of my teaching. So here we have Molly Suckerman-Hartung and Dana DeGulio, who at that time were my students, my grad students, and they're working with Katerina Grossa mixing paint. So Katerina Grossa is an artist from Berlin. She's preparing her golden paints and thinning them down so they can make their way through the airbrush. Here we have an installation by Tony Fair. I was talking to a handful of grad students about Tony Fair and his use and transformation of vernacular material, in this case, painter's tape. Tony came to the Suburban, to Oak Park, right after being in the Istanbul Biennial, and he was very influenced by Islamic abstraction and wanted to transform the windows in this little cinder block space into something quite beautiful. And what's interesting, it looks very simple, very direct. He spent many days in there composing and recomposing to get that sense of harmony. This is a exterior installation by the artist Jean Dunning. It may be a little confusing what you're looking at, but let me assure you it is a thumb, thumbs up. Should you walk to the back, you would be able to see an articulation of a thumbnail and even a little knuckle. However, Jean wanted to position it in this way, so perhaps it looks like a large dreidel or something else. What I liked about this project, she erected the thumbs up as a signifier of civic participation during a presidential season, the fall of a presidential campaign. And what she ended up doing with this little building is making it into an object. And you'll see how this little piece of architecture has been built and rebuilt, that many artists kind of take it on as a shape, as a form, as sculpture. And some artists want to avoid those little spaces that we give them to work in and deal with the domestic setting of the house. Instead, here we have Andres Attell and her smockers. She sent 3 smockers when she was working on her smock shop, and they transformed the house into the smock shop. And here we have an example of that little Suburban, its likeness, kind of verisimilitude, if you will, of the Suburban being rebuilt as at my survey exhibition in Mocha, Cleveland. And then the inside is an installation by Carl Handel. And then one of the very last shows in Oak Park before we moved to Milwaukee was a project by Kevin McGinnis, a Chicago-based artist who ended up making all these nesting, again, a verisimilitude of the structure and nesting one into another into another. The current Suburban is removed from the house, removed from the domestic situation, takes a storefront scenario. So this is the Suburban as it currently exists in Milwaukee, in Milwaukee's River West neighborhood. And the current exhibition is by Polly Applebaum and Stephen Westfall. Here's a detail. For those of you who are going to Oaxaca, here's an example of a rug made by one of the Oaxacan weavers that Stephen Westfall has been working with. And you can see Polly Applebaum's beads, which hang quite beautifully in the space. Just a little shout out to both of these artists. Using vocabulary, very basic, rudimentary, foundational vocabulary. But when it came to installing in a very strange kind of reconfiguration of the new Suburban, they've been around the block. They know how to deal with architecture. They know how to take, again, this vocabulary that we all deal with and really transform the space and really have a beautiful relationship to both color, graphics, the affect, and so forth. So that's the Suburban, should you come and visit us now. This is the Poor Farm. The Poor Farm is in Waupaca County, Wisconsin. It's northeastern Wisconsin, about 40 miles west of Green Bay. It's in a rural setting. The Poor Farm, I'm not going to go too much into the social background of the Poor Farm, but Poor Farms are county-run, or they were county-run social systems. And we purchased this Poor Farm in 2008. We have a cottage and a studio just up the lane, half a mile away. And bringing artists to our home via the Suburban for 17 years. When we started spending more time in the summer, spending more time in the country, we wanted to bring artists with us. So if you would visit right now, we actually have an exhibition by Wynn Greenwood. These exhibitions at the Poor Farm are different than the Suburban, where the Suburban runs very much like galleries. They rotate every 6 to 8 weeks. The Poor Farm rotates exhibitions once a year. And just a couple examples of previous installations, exhibitions. This is Olivier Mosset. These are his monochromes. This is an artist named Chris Barandio, formerly from Chicago, now teaches at Rice. He asked us if he could spend the summer at the Poor Farm, and he said he lost his muse. He wanted to look at clouds, and supposedly this is what he saw when he was looking at clouds during that summer. I would like to say there's a residency component to it, but a very unofficial residency component. If you have a good idea, if there's a reason you should spend some time up in Waupaca County, rural Waupaca County, we say yes. We say yes to sculpture seminar classes at the University of Minnesota. Columbia College in Chicago has brought classes up there. Chris Barandio needed to get out of Houston for a while. So we try to keep it open. My husband and I aren't interested in fixing it. But I am very proud of an exhibition that we launched a couple summers ago. It was a survey exhibition of the video performance work by a deceased artist. She died in 2004. Her name is Gretchen Bender. And Gretchen Bender is loosely affiliated with the picture generation in New York. She was Robert Longo's girlfriend and kind of took a subservient relationship to Robert Longo, a very big ego at the time, still big ego. Really interesting, dealing with the anxiety that that media would produce. And these were, again, video performances that she would create mostly for the kitchen in New York. And when she died in 2004, this is called Total Recall, and it's from the 80s. And when she died in 2004, Robert Longo and Cindy Sherman basically went through her studio and threw most everything away, packed up a bunch of beta tapes and put them in a box and sent them to a small museum in the South. And we tracked those down. So I'm happy to say that this piece has now been screened at the Tate Modern. There's a lot of interest now in her estate, and it's just a reminder that being off-center. So this is somebody, Gretchen Bender is somebody who was really profoundly important to New York, and everybody. And it was a shame that New York didn't move in and take up an institution, taking it up. But what's so interesting is being off-center. Being in Wisconsin, being in the Midwest, gives a really interesting perspective. You can see the blind spots in a city, and again, I'm looking towards New York now, in a city that can actually be overbuilt. So sometimes culturally overbuilt cities can't kind of see what should be in front of them, what to do next. So I like this perspective. I very much appreciate being in the Midwest, but still contributing. So the Gretchen Bender Survey Exhibition, we produced a catalog, and it ended up going to the kitchen. So the idea that one in rural Wisconsin can create programming that goes back to the center is a pretty magnificent task. And in some of the upper galleries, Gretchen also created the kind of title to America's Most Wanted. Some of us remember it, some of us don't. And then a lot of music videos and so forth. So that's what's going on at the Poor Farm. I'll walk through the Whitney Biennial, the 2014 Whitney Biennial, the last biennial in the Breuer building on the Upper East Side on Madison Avenue. As some of you probably heard, the next Whitney Biennial will be in the new piano building downtown, but it's going to be in 3 years as opposed to 2 years. The museum itself is still trying to figure out how much of their new real estate is going to be given over to the biennial. The biennial is typically, when it was at the Breuer building, all floors and all interstitial spaces were up for grabs. And as Anastasia said, it was co-curated by 3 curators. I was the first practicing artist to be asked to curate the biennial. And Donna DeSalvo called it a layer cake effect. So co-curating Whitney biennials, it's common practice. It's been common practice for many, many years. But you don't really get a sense what Michelle Grabner chose or what Stuart Comer chose. And the conceit for the 2014 biennial was that we would each get a floor. And then you, the viewer, could not only get a sense of, call it taste, call it interest, how we think about organizing the space, how we think about juxtapositions, but curating itself would be on the block. Right? Kinds of curating. And that's hugely important. As we know, as artists and art professionals, that curating has a big hand in content building. So I was very interested in this. And I wrestled my way. Maybe a bit of frustration was that the institution didn't decide ahead of time who would get what floor, how the budget would be divided. So it was up to the 3 of us to kind of wrestle that out. I, quite honestly, as an artist, let me tell you this, was at a disadvantage. Stuart Comer came from the Tate Modern. He's a proper curator, gets a paycheck from his institution, and Anthony Elms is coming from the ICA in Philadelphia. So I quite honestly didn't know how the budget worked and how to advocate for my artists as efficiently and effectively as both Anthony and Stuart. However, I did get the 4th floor. It was important to me to look at, and I'll talk a little bit about abstract painting, large-scale abstract painting. And in my negotiations with Stuart and Anthony, Stuart said very clearly that he knew that I was going to focus on abstract painting by women artists. And he was a little disappointed that painting would once again be on the upper floor, especially after the 2012 biennial, in which that floor, the 4th floor, was given over to a massive performance space. So that's just a little example of this negotiation that had to happen. Being an artist who've had many studio visits by Whitney Biennial curators, yet never being in the Whitney Biennial, I thought that it would be very important for me to be as transparent and forthcoming with the artists that I was visiting as possible. When I have had visits by Whitney Biennial curators, they would get a hold of me, they would want to come into the studio, that's fine, but they would never say the word Whitney Biennial. And clearly, come the fall, when I haven't heard from a curator, I would have to suss out on my own that, I was passed over again. I asked my fellow curators why there's not a more direct communication. And the conspiratorial artist in me says, well, it's because you want to maintain your power, you curators. If you make it mysterious, there's something more powerful about you. I think I believed them when they said, no, we don't want to hurt artists' feelings. And I think they were sincere in that comment, but my retort was, we get said no to all the time, that it's actually more respectful to know what's going on than it is to keep us in a kind of situation and being ambiguous about it all. So I really pushed for these infographics. This is just a sketch of how they were thinking about them. They wanted to be playful. They were a little nervous about facts, about me putting out facts, so they decided to use graphics that were as playful as possible. They were not at all interested in a racial representation, something I was really pushing for. That was something that they would not let me do. So in the catalog, this is included in the catalog. So I'll just quickly walk you through my exhibition. Upon coming off the elevator elevator or coming up the stairs on the 4th floor, you were presented with a portrait of our president, President Obama. It was a photograph taken by a Chicago photographer named Dawood Bey. It was taken in 2008. We made great pains to see if Dawood, who is a friend of the president, Dawood lives in Hyde Park, to get into the White House to take another portrait, and that never happened. Setting forth the idea of curriculum building, thinking about organizing an exhibition around the idea of curriculum, and that many public schools not only have the American flag, but they have a portrait of the president at any given time. So they kind of set forward this tone, this commonality, regardless of what kind of political line you fall on. This is our current president. You're also confronted with this very large gray wall, which is actually a canvas. It's the largest stretched painting ever to be exhibited at the Breuer Building, and it's by the artist Galen Gerber, a colleague of mine at the School of the Art Institute, who's very interested in backdrops, creating backdrops. We would consider him very clearly a platformist. And then my extension, my invitation to Galen to participate on that front wall, then Galen was able to ask other artists to exhibit on that wall during the course of the exhibition. So the first half of the biennial, he asked Trevor Samitsu, a young artist based in Los Angeles, to pin his paintings on his canvas. In the second half of the exhibition, David Hammonds and Sherry Levine had to work on Galen's backdrop. So what's very interesting in terms of just a little bit about a platformist practice, in Galen's case, it's very Janus-based, where here he's being very generous and again giving a young artist an opportunity to be in the biennial and not even be curated by one of the curators. So very generous. But at the same time, what happens is Galen then gets to absorb a kind of authority that both David Hammonds and Sherry Levine have. So it's very interesting in terms of that play of authorship. So thinking of the exhibition as curriculum building, but also breaking down then the galleries into these very loose, generalized, nearly cliched thematics. So the first gallery to the right, the first large-scale gallery, I made reference to it offhanded. I made reference to it as a forest of signs, because this was work in this gallery still dealt with appropriation and critique. It dealt with language. It dealt with signs. We're looking here at Shana Lutker, a young lay artist who created this tableau. She's been doing research into the literal fistfights of the surrealists. So she's playing out this tableau, and then you also see another Gretchen Bender, one of the few. It was recreated by a young artist. It was thrown in. It was included in an exhibition called The Forest of Signs in Los Angeles, and then popped into the junk after a show at Metro Pictures. And then a young artist did research and worked with Longo and people who knew it to recreate it. And it was a very interesting. It was one of the kind of highlights of my. Working with the Whitney as an institution, but with the biennial, where the Whitney had a really hard time acknowledging Philip van der Heyden, the young artist who worked and did the research to recreate this piece, to include him as an artist. Institutions, when one thinks about replication, when one thinks about the authentic quality of reproducing something, the institution likes to take on that. And there is actually at many museums, but also at the Whitney, a committee, what is it called? The Committee of Replication, I believe, where you have lawyers and curators and so forth, so they oversee, so value stays fixed. In the end, it was one of the many battles that I think I was successful with, and Philip was a biennial artist. Here we have Ken Lum. You can see Ken Lum's sign. So you really get a sense of language. You see Sarah Charlesworth through the Shana Lutker tableau. Here we have a wall by Carl Handel. These are all graphite and charcoal drawings, direct appropriations, but he's also dealing with framing and trying to link up and start to suggest systems and narratives within it. You have David Diao's large canvas, the green canvas with the blue rectangles, and I don't have any details, so we won't get into that. So that was my forced assign room. So I still embrace and think that work can deal with critique, put forward challenging questions through appropriation. Think about authorship. So it's something that's important to me. So again, building a gallery around work that engages that. In the middle gallery, that center gallery, the bowel of the fourth floor, I was thinking about affect, right? The other to some degree. So if in the Forest of Signs gallery, one was reading, one was analyzing, here one feels, right, the effect of that Sheila Hicks tumbling fibers piece, the effect of color was very important. Elma Allen, the wood pieces that you see kind of tucked just a little bit beyond the Sheila Hicks tumbling tower. So really dealing with affect. In the foreground, you have David Robbins dealing with a little bit of comedy. You can see Donna Nelson's front and back paintings and so forth. So going into a certain kind of affect theory and having that come to the fore, including Sterling Ruby's giant basins, his clay basins, and then also amongst these, material affected objects, painting, large-scale abstraction, and including Laura Owens. Laura Owens has this Picabia-like greeting card effect, and Laura is a complicated painter and somebody I keep very close. I'm always learning something about painting by the very fact she herself is disinterested in it. So she can handle it in great pliability. Laura and I have had some rough patches over the years, and that wasn't a reason to not include her, because again, that wasn't, this is not about personality, but it was really interesting because she withheld what she was doing from me. She said yes to the invitation, but she was very coy about what she was developing for the biennial, to the point where she wouldn't put it on the truck from LA with the rest of the work. She had Gavin Brown ship it so nobody could see it right up to the date. And more interestingly, there are paintings that I never got to see that she hung behind this painting that you're looking at. So between those bars, between those stretcher bars in the back, she made paintings that she denied even the curator of the exhibition to see. And when I asked her about that, she said, well, Michelle, it's the Whitney Biennial and it's, subjected to a lot of harsh criticism, and I wanted to protect those paintings. And I believe that to some degree is the case, but I also gave her an opportunity to push at me, to push at our history, and to evolve and to think about display, hanging, denial, and how that plays in. And there's a bit of, if you can read the painting, it says something about, when you come to the end of your rope, make a knot and hang on, right? Okay, a kind of happy hang in there, but then it's and hang. So there's always this little bit of counter push that she ends up giving us. And then Jacqueline Humphrey's large-scale canvases, subject being light. These things changed from every position you were in. Joel Otterson is in the foreground on your left. This is a tent he made out of some doilies that his grandmother left him. The chandeliers are also his. Again, glasses inverted from a thrift shop, and then a large beaded curtain. So really taking on craft, but also taking on gender identity. And there's a beautiful handmade quilt that's folded up inside the tent, and it has it embroiders the contour of a cowboy. And Joel reminds us that, so we never have to sleep alone. There's a cowboy in there. So, and also you see Amy Sealman's paintings, and then Amy Sealman working with another artist, Pam Linz, on a sculptural piece. So thinking about display with Amy's work, and you catch the back of Donna's painting. Here's the front of Donna's painting. If I would give myself one indulgence, it was the inclusion of Dan Walsh, a painter who, extraordinary painter that I'm pulled to in terms of how he thinks about pattern, how he thinks about surface, and so forth. And then you have John Mason, a longtime artist who has worked in clay, a master at the slab. I mean, there's nobody who can move clay slab around and have it stay in geometric perfection the way John Mason does. And then there's a handful of galleries in the back. Ricky Swallow, a Los Angeles-based artist. This was coming into a black and white scenario. More Dawood Bey, Suzanne McCullen, Tony Lewis. One of the more contentious inclusions on my floor was David Foster Wallace's notebooks. You either thought it was a good idea or you thought it was a very, very bad idea. I still stand by the fact that it's a good idea, because David Foster Wallace teaches me a lot, has taught me a lot, particularly Boredom again, if we can circle back around to Boredom, and his posthumously published text, The Pale King, dealing with IRS agents in Peoria, perhaps the most boring job one could possibly have in a very boring part of the world, and to find transcendence within that. And in his notes, in preparation and in writing, there's these beautiful Midwestern isms. David Foster Wallace coming from Illinois as well. So David Foster Wallace not only, again, thinking about boredom, but also thinking about how I was organizing the exhibition, as I was saying earlier, around these themes, these very broad, generalized, may I say even cliched themes. They're certainly not inclusive. I could take these same themes and I could engage another very different set of 53 artists and still get at some of the issues that I was interested in. But I wasn't afraid of generalities. I wasn't afraid of these big, broad ideas. When one thinks about curriculum, one has to start by introducing these ideas and then move into them, kind of wormhole into them. So David Foster Wallace reminds us that cliches are built on some truths, and that's an important thing. We just happen as a culture to have a great allergy to cliches. We like to be very specific in our work, in our research. There was some in his books, and these notebooks came from the Ransom Center at the University of Texas, an extraordinary archive. I recommend that you go there at some point. One of the back galleries, Shoko Saka, is a ceramic-based artist in Los Angeles, so a display of her vessel work. And then Stephen Barron's, an artist also from Los Angeles, a photographer, a longtime photographer. I only included two photographers, two bodies of photography. Photography confuses me. I was having great conversations with some students today about photography being more about its fluid circulation than it is about its subject. And here it's very interesting where Stephen Barron's basically takes the same image. It's an image when he was in Rome, the American Academy, out his window. And what happens by just using the printer, this inkjet printer that we're all very familiar with, by running that same image through the printer again and again, you evoke a kind of painting. You evoke neoclassicism, you evoke a romanticism when it gets dark. The monochrome comes to the forward. So it's so interesting in terms of how one can take and think about the process of photography and printing and have a conversation about the history of painting. Another contentious and still very, sometimes still very hot inclusion was, again, Danelle Wolford. Maybe we can get into that when I talk to, if you have questions, or when I talk to Mac, because there's a lot of backstory to it. Danelle Wolford, I also invited the YAMs. How do you say YAM in Africa? A large, what they call themselves a large queer dark-skinned collective of 40-plus artists. The YAMs didn't exist until I went to Sienna Shield's studio in Dumbo and invited her to participate in my my video program. So, since I invited her, she wanted to know if she could, bring together her friends, bring together musicians, performers, writers, and I said yes. And I think that the great point of this, even though they ended up screening the piece they made for the biennial and then pulling it and not continuing to show it, is that the Whitney Biennial or institutions can still manifest something that doesn't exist, manifest a collective, and this collective can then come back and bite it in the ass. That's an amazing thing. There's still, if institutions can still make room for that, I think it's pretty terrific. And then finally, an offsite piece by a Chicago-based artist, Tony Tassett. This is called Artist Monument. It's huge. It's two truck trailers that have been cladded with plastic that has names of artists. And those of you who've had exhibitions probably could find their name alphabetically on this monument. 400,000 names of artists working in the world right now. And it was installed in Chelsea. So, my need for inclusion, thinking about the task of a biennial, one has to, as a curator, make selections, but at the same time, I can be working with Tony as inclusive as possible. So in conversation with Mac, maybe we can, if you have questions, we can look at the biennial a little bit further. And to go quickly through my own work, Anastasia did a fantastic job in terms of introducing my interest in repetition, my relationship to the domestic in work, but also time and boredom, that kind of control that I'm interested in. And also kind of witty plays, particularly with Gingham. I'll talk a little bit about Gingham, but this is Friedrich Froebel. Friedrich Froebel is always foundational to how I think and work in the studio. Friedrich Froebel was the German philosopher who invented the tenets of kindergarten, where one comes to knowledge by the things, by handling. He created these gifts. So before one comes to the complications of language, one has to understand color, texture, touch. This is one of his gifts. So basically it's a little ball that one would swing. You would get this centrifugal force. You feel the physical world at work. On your finger, you get texture, you get color. Very similar to Montessori and her teaching beads, her mathematical learning technique, her pedagogy in terms of coming to understand the more complex computations of math through color, through geometry, through touch. So this is how we come to know the world, very important. So again, something very foundational to my studio and thinking of a system of value in terms of knowledge. Other sources, Sheila Hicks, these are early Sheila Hicks weavings. This is a diagonal. These are little samplers. Here we have Sheila Hicks, who some of you know, was in the painting program at Yale with Elbers in the 50s and started turning her stretchers into looms. So moving from a position of painting and its authority to weaving, textile, women's work. This is a very nice photograph. It's in the collection at MoMA. It's by the German couple, not the Beckers, but the Blumas. And the Blumas did this series where they were really picking fun at the German middle class for a while. But I show you this for my own kind of personal illustration of control and order. So here we have potatoes. Potatoes, the stability of the middle class. If those potatoes had a mind of their own and started flying out, it would change structure of society. I can tell you, I love to work. I get a lot of work done. I'm always the happiest when I'm working, but there has to be a sense of order for that work to be done. So this is my hell. I'm just showing you my absolute hell. On Kawara, the idea of measuring time, measuring day time, the work time, right? That 8-hour day, which, you know, we're a precariat class now. So that 8-hour day is very strange in terms of thinking about labor. John Baldessari, I will not make any more boring art. He says that tongue in cheek. I embrace what he says. Or push at what he says. And I'm just going to walk through a series of paintings that I was doing right out of grad school. Again, looking for that order, right? Looking to make sure those potatoes do not leave the counter, and looking towards backdrops. The backdrops of the domestics are looking at weavings, looking at the organization of pattern and so forth in my backdrop. I was telling a student today that in the Middle Ages, any dot pattern that was irregular and not ordered was there was a repulsion because it reminded one of pox, one of disease, and moral breakdown. So pattern, and why again we're drawn to pattern and organization. So some of these things you may recognize. This is a jute placemat. These are large, these would be the holes inside of a knitted blanket. These are all indexical paintings. This is a painting of car beads. Many of you don't even know these exist. You have to be my age. We sat on beads for a long time. We would line our driving side of the car with this web of beads that was supposed to give us comfort. So using these backdrops as again an index, and then going through and painting either the positive or negative, and thinking about edge. So thinking about where that geometry, the perfect geometry of the support works against the body, the material body of that thing that I was indexing. They're all enamel on wood, on panel. There was a couple years in which I was pumping flocking into that wet enamel, so you had the reverse texture from hard and glossy to soft and fuzzy. So we were looking at some flocked canvases, again, granny squares, crocheted patterns and so forth. This is a Gingham painting. I'm really embracing Gingham because Gingham is actually an illusion, right? If it's not actually woven, right, you get this pattern. So the pattern suggests a kind of play. So it's both like I said, a kind of allusion to weaving, a pattern that, again, represents a kind of wholesomeness, particularly in the States. So Gingham has become really important to me. So again, a grand cliche, but also an extraordinary abstraction. After the indexical paintings, I was working through these large tondos. I didn't want to use an index anymore, but I'm anti-compositional, found composition, I should say. So dealing with these Archimedes spirals, starting with dots and moving towards the outside. What's interesting with this kind of work, this very kind of fine motor skill work, it's important work. It consumes a kind of time. I can tell you that I find these works very vulgar. I don't enjoy looking at these paintings. I love looking at the Ginghams, but they're very important to make. They're very optical, they're very active. It's, again, once they flip them up, it's like, okay, that's all right. Some people really enjoy that kind of opticality with the work, but for me, it really is about this relationship to work and having almost an antagonistic relationship to things that one does, the result of one's work. All right, so I'm moving through these relatively quickly. And then after that kind of fine motor, one thinks about the body, one thinks about kind of the athletic qualities, how one uses the body in repetition for long periods of time, very important. So thinking about a radiant symmetry. And again, these are silver points, so dealing with a material that actually changes over time, another silver point. And then returning recently to the indexical paintings, thinking about what those backdrops meant when in the 80s when I had young kids running around the house, when I was using their blankets from their cribs as source material for my paintings. And now, the kids are grown. I do have an 11-year-old, but she's not interested in blankets and crocheted bits. And I have a different domestic situation, a different kind of relationship to the domestic. So again, taking on some of these, they're no longer backdrops, but they're artifacts. They're a relationship to craft and work. These are from my show at James Cohan Gallery in New York a year ago, so I'll walk through a handful of these. This is a small little study, and here's an installation of the James Cohan Gallery. So I work with my husband on these large-scale sculptures, and the front back is important, what gets featured, this other kind of support. These are large, they're garbage can lids that we hammered down. So they create this kind of beautiful, again, kind of reflective aluminum, something like aluminum foil, but a little sturdier, and then a silver point and a painting. And underneath this hanging object, it's counterbalanced, and I'll show you that in a second, it's a platform of weavings. So going back for a second to Friedrich Froebel, weavings was one of his gifts. How do we come to know the world under fine motor skills with using young little hands, learning to use the scissors and so forth. But the endless amounts of pattern in simple math become really important. And then the counterpoint, what is supporting or counter-supporting the big disc is little dangles, little kind of elements from, who potentially Michelle Grabner can be. There's a large portrait of my family with my 3 children and my husband in my garden in Wisconsin, my daughter's table, and a cast concrete chair. And quite interestingly and almost intentionally, it was a red herring. We like narrative. We like to talk about identity. We like to talk about how, our identity shapes our artwork. Okay, that's fine. But to be able to dangle this in Chelsea like a bait, like a red herring, that's exactly where critics are going to go. They're going to look at this life, and they're going to leave the painting and the abstraction alone. And I'm new to these paintings again. It's been, nearly 15 years since I made those paintings. I, like Laura, need to protect them. I need to kind of focus on something else, and that red herring being narrative. And sure enough, the critic for the New York Times, Ken Johnson, was all over it. Called me a soccer mom, which I'm not. Called me, he looked at me. He didn't look at the work. So I made Ken Johnson a Gingham soccer ball, which has been very successful. All right. And then just a couple installation shots of my exhibition at the IMA, the Indianapolis Museum of Art, large-scale galleries. I've also been working with football, NFL. These prints here are actually reprints, direct appropriations of a project Nancy Holt did in 1987 called Time Out. And then some bleachers turned on its edge with video components and so forth, and a very large-scale platform of paper weavings with some silver point. This is a current exhibition in London at Rocket Gallery in Hackney right now, so you can see that again, a relationship to Gingham pattern. I started using oil, doing research this summer when I was teaching at Squehegan on Mars and Hartley, and that was very important to me, just thinking about process and never working in oil paint since I was an undergrad, and bringing that back when I'm in the remote of Maine. And then some paper weavings that were hung on a wall. I've never hung the paper weavings on a wall before, and I'm trying to get that sense of impact. And then I opened up an exhibition on Friday at a gallery in Milwaukee called Green Gallery, and it includes some bronze pieces. And when I'm working on these indexes and I'm sacrificing, blankets to stenciling to painting, what do I do with these blankets? They're painted, they're encrusted. So I decided that I would, to some degree, memorialize them and cast each in bronze. And it's a lost wax process, so the blankets get sacrificed. And then, do I consider myself a sculptor? I don't think it matters. But it's just pointing out how one process leads to another process, and it may bring you from painting to bronze sculpture pretty easily and seamlessly. And I'm very happy about it, and it's new to me, and I'm quite excited about it. So that was a long overview, and Mac will help me unpack some of the things that I brought up because he knows his stuff. All right.
Oh, that's fine. 20 minutes is,
It's
all relative.
Yes.
Well, thanks, Michelle. I mean, I can't overstate how pleasurable it's been to get to know you over the time that you've been out here and coming out and doing these visits with our students and just this amazing talk. It's really great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And so I'm going to keep it pretty loose. I just have a few questions. I mean, I have actually several questions, but I assume that my colleagues and peers and students in the audience also have questions, so I promise not to hog the mic. So I am just going to go ahead and start, and maybe after one or two questions, I will feel free to open it up, and if there's anything even that you would love a clarification or to dig deeper into, please just raise your hand, and I'll try to keep my eye out for those raised hands. I love this Saul Ostro interview that happened a few years ago, which you may not have loved, but there was a lot of really these lovely moments in it where he sort of frames you in this Midwestern sense, which I thought was a little overdone. But one thing that really caught me in this was this idea that of all of these things that you do, they happen. You sort of make these things happen through a community, like the community is a really large part of your practice, not just in the studio, but also, of course, when you move to Chicago and doing the Suburban, even prior to being in Chicago, in Milwaukee and curating shows there with your husband. And he has this great quote where he says, she addresses her own needs as well as those of her immediate community, which, because she is a citizen of the art world, happens to be both local and international. And I just thought that was a beautiful quote, and I'm wondering what things like that you might bring to the Portland Biennial or to the Oregon Biennial.
That's interesting. Yes. All right. Yeah, a little bit what I was suggesting in terms of a relationship to the studio. I mean, there is just base curiosity in terms of getting out there and thinking, and also this part of the world, the Northwest, is. I haven't spent much time out here. And so a curiosity in terms of practice, in ideas, in thinking, in craft. And it's been giving, I have to say, that we can talk about the bits of things that have been floating to the surface. But community, I mean, there's already a beautiful built-in community at Disjecta. And so working with the people there and bouncing ideas off of them, they're doing much more than organizing, much more than the structural underpinnings of the exhibition, and then kind of laying out the map for me, but then being in Eugene and seeing a community at the university there and being in studios there. So seeing multiple communities going all the way down to Ashland, where somebody who I've worked with for many years, Matthew Delegat, curated an exhibition at the Schneider Museum. So what's interesting is that yes, of course, there's many communities, but those communities overlap. And I understand that, I, over many years, have been able to kind of pull these communities together. Whether they're in the wake of my work, they will, naturally overlap. The thing that I want to remind young people and artists is that you have to trust that to some degree. That over time, and we're not very good with time, like I said, it's very hard for us to see long arcs, right? To see the distance. It took me a very long time to be able to move out of like the presentness and the anxieties of the moment, and to trust within the art world that not only communities will come together, they will evolve, and that you can be an agent for that in just by putting one's head down, working and articulating what one is interested in. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there's a large part of that, I think, that happens here in terms of a work ethic, and I think that which is what's so exciting about you curating the biennial this year. And there's also, you're sort of talking about these overlaps, which I also find curious because there's so much of what your practice is so separated, that like the curation is over here, the writing is over here. I mean, and like these things, they play out. I mean, and I think Laura Owens is a great example. Here's somebody you've written about and then put into the exhibitions, and then these sort of funny things start happening through these relationships. But that's still like these things are pretty separated in your life. The writing, you're not making artworks that are about, say like somebody like Dan Devening in Chicago, who's a galleryist and has his own space, and his work is really about supports and the way in which support structures operate within a gallery system, and that's become his work. But your work isn't like that. You're very rooted in these paintings, and I'm curious about that separation.
Yeah, sure. I think I can answer that a couple ways, and those all the ways that I'm going to lay out there have truth to them. So there's not one that's better than the other. First of all, and maybe I feel a little uncomfortable saying it, but it's very honest, and that is I'm very selfish about the studio work, right? So as a human being, dealing with pattern, repetition, and time, I have other compulsions. I want to look at figurative painting. I want to think about narrative construction. I want to see how institutions function where they fail. So I have these other needs as somebody who is active, looking, and again, compelled by the art world. As we all know, we who have studio practices know that painting is not the good venue, or bronze casting is not going to deal with all those other curiosities, right? So writing and curating does. Saying yes to coming out and working with your students here, helps me kind of understand a relationship to what my institution is doing well or not. So it's teaching. So there's limitations, and I think the less you ask, and I don't, asking something from again painting, is very specific. So so are they separated? I guess what I'm doing, what I'm setting forth there, Mac, is that painting in studio is pretty primary, right? It's very important, and these other things that I do, I learn about the context in which my work exists in. I learn about the context in which I have to have conversations with other artists, or my teaching exists in. And I think I'm okay about talking about, not just, I can have good conversations about many things outside of abstraction, or thinking about abstraction. So separate, I still think, I have all these interests, and they just manifest in different ways.
Yeah, they're feeding each other all the time. That's clear. I would definitely open it up to the audience if there was somebody out there with a burning question. So otherwise, I will keep going. Yes, please.
My memory is correct, but did somebody intentionally drive a car into the Suburban?
Yeah, before Peter picked me up, I was looking at this very long slide presentation, and I edited those out. I actually had a little video of the car backing in. So Dana DeGulio, who was one of my students, grad students in painting and drawing at the School of the Art Institute, who, with a handful of her colleagues, opened up a space called Julius Caesar, a very important space that goes on, and it has evolved. They're no longer, the original founders are no longer involved. But Dana was pictured mixing paint with Caterina Grossa. And we became close. She graduated, she was my TA, so there was both a friendship, there was something maternal about her relationship. The Suburban itself has become quite iconic in terms of artist-run spaces, being quite old, being around for a very long time. So it was interesting. She asked me this summer before the biennial opened if she could how did she say this? Push up a wrecked car against the Suburban. I don't know if she said pushed up, but what I heard is wrecked car from Mothers Against Drunk Driver installed outside of the Suburban, right? We volley in illusions, right? We're artists, so I just assumed that it would look like the car drove into it. What Dana did is very psychologically complex. She took a painting that I gave her in trade for doing some editing, and she went to my gallery without telling me in New York and asked the gallery to sell it so she could get money to buy a car from Indiana that had poor brakes, that she then did drive into the Suburban. She was, to her credit, she did a lot of research. She went in backwards because if she would have went in nose first, it would have crumbled on top of her. So her safety and doing a lot of research into crash test dummies. She's a small woman. But when she asked me if she would do this, I kind of immediately said yes, because, I was quite distracted with the biennial. The Suburban's been going on for a very long time. And let me tell you, if you run artist-run spaces, you lose sense of when they're valuable and when they're not, right? There's other forces and contexts in the world that, sometimes you're getting calls from Luke Toymans, who says he wants to do an exhibition there. And we showed Luke. Luke asked if he could show painting at the Suburban. And that's crazy. Like, well, we must be doing something right. That's so interesting. And then there's other times where it feels like it's a little bit on life support, right? So that happens over when one has a project that has a long arc to it, right? So the fact that you wanted to do this, I thought, yeah, I need to rethink this. This is, again, selfishly, this impact will have me rethink it. So yes, yeah, it was a good project. We had to rebuild it though. It was, it was good.
While we're talking about the Suburban, I was curious, as somebody who has lovingly followed the Suburban for a number of years now, I've always been stymied by your website. And the sort of single black and white image that represents each project. And I was really curious, to me, there's something about this essential image that happens. I think about maybe Paul Cause's The Sound of Ice Melting, and we all know that one black and white photo of it that's in every conceptual art book. Yeah. And there seems to be an echoing of that perhaps, but I'm curious to know.
Again, website, when did we start? 1999, right? So that was a long time ago, and not a heck of a lot was available in terms of what a website could be. It's interesting because I handed it off fairly immediately to an undergrad to take it on, even though I set the aesthetic conditions of the website. And Forrest Nash, who runs Contemporary Art Daily, which is another kind of force of power within the world that we exist in, was a student at the Art Institute, and still to this day updates the website. Wow. So we have this very funny collashing of Contemporary Art Daily, which confuses me in all kinds of ways, and then again the essential bits of what the website is. Yeah, I think you get to a point where you don't rethink it anymore. Yeah, again, we'll see what happens. It will be interesting and it will be pathetic at any given time.
Is there another question from the audience, perhaps? Yes, please.
You spoke earlier about sort of an antagonistic relationship to what one does, and that really resonated with me because you speak a lot about curiosity and boredom. So I was wondering sort of what the relationship between those two were.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a relationship. I think it's all part of, just who I end up being, or who the human is, right? In terms of the things that we're drawn to and the things where, we have to have this other kind of relationship with. We have to, get the heart racing, feel uncomfortable about something. So it's different ways of existing, right? Towards work, right? So these states of boredom, paying attention when one fails to pay attention and when the rote starts to break, right? Or paying attention too much, something else starts to fail within it. So to find these moments, particularly in making those paintings, So that is hugely important and gives, in a way, in terms of a relationship to time and to making, and this protracted amount of time, an uncomfortable amount of not even knowing as you're rotating day after day after day, as you're making those things, and not even knowing you're actually, it's something's building, right? And then when you flip them up, you have this immediate, for me anyways, this really antagonistic relationship to the opticality, the immediacy, the demand that they have on them. When, I thought that in its making, we struck a deal, right? Me and the painting struck this deal. Long, protracted time. We were working together. And then on the wall, it becomes something else. And it's, again, there is some people are drawn to, again, that kind of opticality, that movement, that action. And for me, that's what I run away from. I would say that would be equivalent to the potatoes in the air, right? This kind of disorder, this discord that comes. So I know when to deploy it, and I think this is what's important, is to know when you need that antagonism, that anxiousness, and when you don't need it, when you need to have this other kind of relationship to time. And you may need that within a day. You may be flipping back and forth between writing, some boredom, some anxiousness, or it may be months in that boring place. So that's the choreographing is, I think, is the answer to your question.
There was another question over here. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you're talking about. I'd like to say that an interview that happened way before the biennial, talking about the Suburban being anti-curator, which got kind of pulled into Michelle being antagonistic towards curators, anti-curator, right? Where the Suburban, we don't curate, right? I mean, the closest I come to curating, and I even feel uncomfortable doing this, is actually getting Polly and Stephen on a schedule. We have to have an opening date and a closing date. But, I don't talk to them about what they need, what works I would like them to see. So it's not curating, it's actually closer. I want the Suburban, or the Suburban has in the past was more closely aligned to the studio, right? Where in the suburbs, one is pretty protected. So I can give you an example. David Reed, who is a prominent New York abstract artist, never showed his drawings, and he asked if he could use the Suburban as a place to exhibit these drawings that he's never showed before, and he just needed to kind of think that through, what it means to get these up on the wall, think of them cohesively. And within 2 years, he had a show of his drawings in Stuttgart. But so there's a kind of protection that happens. The audience, it's attached to the house. It's in the suburbs. So there's a little nurturing that takes place. So it's some of the decisions we make in terms of display and exhibition, and thinking about a body of work can happen in the Suburban. Just because it's built a little differently. So that's where that came from, that kind of relationship to not curating at the Suburban. The Poor Farm, there's some curatorial decisions that happen there. And by the way, the Poor Farm is a true not-for-profit space. So that was that reference. So I for some reason it stuck that Michelle is anti-curator, anti-curation. And sometimes it's not necessary to curate. Sometimes we as artists we're always doing it, quite honestly. This is where I have a problem with curatorial studies programs, that, as artists, we know we do that. We always have done that. So the professionalizing of it, to some degree, it's a little uncomfortable for me, but and sometimes, selection is at hand. I'm going to make selections for the Portland Biennial, right? I'm going into many, many studios, and I will select artists who will be in the biennial. But I'm also valuing the process itself. And to the point where at Disjecta for the 2016 Portland Biennial, hopefully, if artists agree, every studio that I visit, right, the 100+ studios that I'm in throughout Oregon, every artist will be represented at Disjecta. So you'll get a sense of, what my reach was, what I was looking at. And then there will be venues throughout the state that will feature the artists that were selected from that pool.
Yes.
Yeah, and again, it's a little bit that red herring that I was telling you about. We all want, a story about Michelle, and then Michelle happens to have kids, and, she works from home and so forth. Well, I think the power in that is to use it when you need to use it, and don't when you don't need to use it, right? I'm not living into that, and, quite honestly, your relationship to those things change over time too. So I think, maybe it's a feminist position, but to be able to deploy it when you can,
I think there's something in there too I was curious about. When you were talking about the love of the studio, the first image you show was of Bruce Nauman, this sort of post-studio artist. And I was just really curious what like Bruce Nauman feeds into you, into your work, into your being.
Oh, that's so interesting that you say that. And this is, I hang on to this. It's a funny thing that, there's no way to say this without it sounding just weird and terrible. But he's the artist I want to be. And it's, again, because of freedom. This is a man who does only what he needs to do, and because it's the work that he will do, only the work that needs to be done. And at this point, I worked on a print project with him in Madison, and at this point in his life, he's not going to suffer fools, and he can see very clearly within the art world. So it's a position of authority and power that I'm drawn to, but also a dedication to work.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe just one or two more questions. Yes, please.
I was wondering, as both of a curator and a practicing artist, how you manage to expose yourself, especially maybe earlier on in your career, to new artists, maybe emerging artists, and how you include them in some of your spaces, your galleries, and maybe also how other curators you've worked with might approach them.
Yeah. One answer is that, I've been teaching for a long time, and I have I'm always interfacing with grad students, and, that there is something about that. I often think about the Suburban as, again, what I was saying, a relationship to an extension of my pedagogy, right? That here you have students who can come in and work directly with artists and have this other experience, and kind of folding them and then offering them, you build up a trust and, handing it over to those artists, and to the point where, again, the Julius Caesar emerged because of the Suburban, and because all those early Julius Caesar people were in a seminar that I was teaching, and they was, the assignment to kind of make the space, and they launched it. But, to be, I think, more pointed to your question is that with the biennial, I made it very clear at the get-go that I wasn't interested in looking at including emerging artists in the biennial. I was interested in looking at artists who were teachers, who were influencing young artists. I made that very clear. And so the average age of the artists in my biennial was maybe my age, 53. Again, there were some artists, but for the most part, and I'm one of those people who don't know if artists are fully formed for a while. That doesn't mean they have to not exhibit, but maybe that exhibition is on, that they're doing that. So if I'm bringing in artists like Polly and Stephen, right? If you start a project space and you're bringing in artists who have connections, who are well established, it's a networking scenario, right? So it's not just showing young artists, but showing artists who are mature, and then who will, have conversations with my grad students who show up, and then my grad students will see them somewhere else, and that's how young artists kind of move through the world. So it's a relationship to networking. I to be perfectly honest, I'm in a lot of young artist studios all the time. If I'm going to invite artists and spend a lot of time with artists, I'm going to want to learn something from them, right? The way I hopefully teaching young artists. And, so selfishly, we'll bring in Polly and Stephen, because Stephen is still teaching me about abstraction.
Maybe just one more question then. There was somebody over here. All the way in the back.
Can you hear me?
You might have to stand up.
Okay.
Yeah, not directly. There is a lot of research, a lot of writing that is looking at the suburbs, and again, the history of the suburbs, and the scape. I mean, this is not where the avant-garde has emerged. The suburbs is not that site, but in its vacancy, right? What can happen? Yeah, I'm aware of it, but I'm not taking it on in a curatorial way. I mean, I think right now the suburban is actually in River West, which pushes against the inner city. There's nothing suburban about it anymore. So I'm really kind of actively thinking about, the profound social problems, racial problems in Milwaukee, and how the suburban can actually engage or push at or kind of create this relationship, which is almost the other to the suburbs. I think, my little anecdote about Frank Lloyd Wright is kind of where, the idea of moving to the suburbs as a place of work, the place where women raised kids, where kids were educated, the kind of leafy green bits, that can be actually a site in which, in Frank Lloyd Wright's case, evolved a vocabulary, a relationship to landscape, and a philosophy in relationship to pedagogy, early pedagogy, as his sisters and wife taught Montessori, and have that kind of relationship. That happened in the suburbs. It wasn't going to be happening in the Loop in downtown Chicago. So that was the thing that I held on to in terms of Oak Park. Thanks.
Wow, thank you so much. I really look.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Mac. What a lovely talk and conversation. Thank you all for your good questions. Michelle is going to be in Portland off and on through the next year, so there'll be more chances as well. Please come back out. I want to thank everyone here at PNCA for the visit, the MFA students, Disjecta, and the organizers of the Portland Biennial. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Please come back on, we have several events that are happening this weekend. The MFA in Visual Studies Studios at now 321 Northwest Gleason. That's right down the street. We have open studios on Saturday and Sunday. Saturday from 6 to 9, Sunday from about 2 to 6. So please come out, see some more studios. And thank you again. Have a good night.